in that gospel reading, and even more when we think about how we might connect it to All Saints' Day. But all week, my heart and my ears have been catching on where Jesus says, but listen, love your enemies. And it probably has something to do with the climate we find ourselves in these days in our culture, but love your enemies has been weighing on me this week, partly maybe because we're super good at the enemies part and a little ambivalent about the love part these days. Love your enemies. Now, we should say before we go any further that sometimes that whole section there has been used to tell people in abusive or dangerous situations that they should just turn the other cheek and go ahead and keep taking it. And that's not what Jesus is saying at all. So just be aware that that is not what we are being invited into. Loving your enemies doesn't mean saying, great, evil, go for it, have a field day, right? But it does mean something real and something serious. And in a time where it feels like we know that word enemy too well and maybe have forgotten how to use the word neighbor, I think it's really important. We are in a moment, and it's always the case when you watch advertising, but particularly in a moment of politics and in our culture where we have been relying on fear. Instead of being persuasive by making our point, the easiest and least effortful way to make your point and to persuade someone is simply to make sure that the people who disagree with you look like Satan. And so then, of course, you must join my side, right? Right? They are terrible. You would not believe what they said, did, thought, what, ill will they bear to all of humanity. You must be on my side. And everyone does it because it is the easiest and most effective argument to get to that part of our brain that doesn't do a lot of thinking and does a lot of reacting, right? And in our culture right now, that's what we're doing. We make our neighbors into enemies, so we call them those people or whatever it is. And so in a society that was built to deal with difference, right? I mean, we have the blessing of living in a democracy that was designed to handle the fact that we don't all agree, and how are we all going to get along and be neighbors together? We put all these systems in place, and even in that kind of a society, we get really freaked out about our differences. And our loudest voices and the most pathetic corners of the internet and everywhere in between, we hear that language, enemy, danger, hostile, right? And we don't hear the word neighbor. Now, we all know that line in Scripture where Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. It's about like do unto others as you would have them do to you. Love your neighbor as yourself. And when Jesus said that, if you remember, when he said that, immediately the very next question was, and who is my neighbor, Jesus? Like, where exactly are the lines? How many people do I have to love? Does this guy count over here? And Jesus tells that story about the Good Samaritan to say, you have no idea who your neighbor is. Your neighbor is a lot bigger than you think, right? And we do this all the time to try to wiggle out of neighbors. We try to keep folks from moving in that we don't think should be nearby. We focus on all of our differences, and we find ways to separate out by political preference, by age, by race, by social class, and we find the longer we do it, the more tough the boundaries are, right? And again, what we do is we make our neighbors a little bit less human. And soon enough, we're calling them enemies. And then we don't have to even like them, right? Much less love them. Okay, great. And so I often wonder if Jesus isn't escalating here, right? I know that love your neighbors, you're going to try to wiggle out of. So how about love your enemies, right? Can I be any more clear? Love your enemies. Just in case you have tried to wiggle out of that category, neighbor, which is the language that Jesus gave us. And we all try to wiggle, right? No, but Jesus gave us that language of neighbor. But in case we try to wiggle out of it, he says, all right, even your enemies. And there are real enemies too, aren't there? I mean, we are lucky to be in a place where we are safe most of the time and well, but there are places and times that are very different. We had a field trip Wednesday with our confirmation students to hear Lamech Bowie speak at VU, and it may or may not have started when one of the pastors looked at her calendar and went, "Oh, but I'd like to do that instead of teach confirmation on Wednesday night. I'd like to meet that saint of God, and hey, maybe our kids should meet her too." And so we had this opportunity to go and hear this woman speak. She's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Speak about the struggle for peace in Liberia, to speak about the women that she organized with. It wasn't just her. There were thousands who found a way to respond to the war, to the violence, when they had every reason to hate, every reason to hit back, and they found another way to do it. The pain and the trauma that was in those communities was on a scale that I really can't quite fathom, in terms of it being, you know, the guy who killed your brother. You see him walking down the street, and you know the other guy, and sort of the descriptions of this reality just sort of started to numb me, and I'm sure she was giving a very edited version. And so the desire to hit back and the desire to return just a little bit of suffering for the suffering you've given me is superhuman, isn't it? That is completely natural to who we are, but that's not how peace came. Peace came not because somebody had bigger guns. Peace came because they found a strategy that sounded an awful lot like Jesus' words, love your enemies. One of the amazing leaders we met in South Africa who worked against apartheid said that one of the challenges was finding ways to resist and to work for peace and justice that were consistent with the mind of Christ. That if we are going to have any integrity in this process, it has to be consistent with the mind of Christ. And this is the story of Liberia. There's a story that faith leaders did not allow. It was a lovely question. Someone said, well, what role did faith have in all of this? And we're asking about her personal faith, and sometimes she speaks quite clearly about that. But her answer was, well, our religious leaders, Christian and Muslim, did not allow for division. So whenever possible, they came together and they spoke against this. And they said, this is not a division based on faith. And in fact, these are not enemies, these are neighbors, right? So that's something consistent with the mind of Christ. And then women showed up for day after day after day after day across all dividing lines, Muslim, Christian, sitting down outside of the House of Government to pray and sing and pray and sing and wave the signs and show up wearing white day after day after day, camp out on a soccer field. That's how you get people's attention sometimes, right? Not violent, to sing and pray. And eventually, as the peace process was going on, and there were some peace talks going on in Ghana in a hotel, and the muckety-mucks were not making the compromises that they needed to, right? That when guns are pointed at one another, you're willing to compromise. And now that things have cooled off a bit, everybody sort of retrenches in their positions. And so things weren't going anywhere. And so a bunch of women assembled there, and they sat down right in front of the doors of the hotels, just plunked down, said, we're not going anywhere, and neither are you until you get this figured out. And we mean it. And if you try to leave and cross these doors, we're going to strip naked and stand here. And, so if someone asks for your cloak, give them your shirt also. It's a way of shaming the people that were there. You need to act like adults, and it's time to lead our communities. And in their culture, your grandma stripping naked in front of you, well, not even in this culture, right? That would get your attention, and you would do what you needed to do, right? And so people will say even that Jesus' words are along those lines, that would bring shame to the person who is assaulting you in a way that is not violent, in a way that is not hostile, in a way that sees them as another human being and even as a neighbor, right? So we are called to love our neighbors. We are called to love our enemies. And we wanted to go on Wednesday night so that we could see someone who had some good practice with that, right? To see it in the flesh. On All Saints' Day, we remember the patriarchs and all these wonderful saints, and that is great so long as we're remembering that they were human beings, right? That they were just us thousands of years ago, and that God can do these things through people. right? And that God actually honestly does call us to love our enemies, not just sort of mean well. And that's really hard, right? And so it's really a gift when you can see in the flesh someone who has been doing this. And so we went to go see her to know that Jesus isn't pretending that with God these things are possible. One line that she had for us, she said, "You cannot give what you do not have." And this was in context of someone who wanted to join the movement and the work that she was doing with trauma victims in restoring and bringing some forgiveness and life and moving forward. And this person had all kinds of bitterness, perfectly reasonable bitterness for the terrible things that had happened in her life. But she said, I had to tell her, you can't do this yet. You can't give what you don't have. You haven't got any peace yet. You have to work on forgiving for your own health, and then you can do these other things. You cannot give what you do not have. And for us, the good news is that word inheritance. We have everything that we need, right? We have been given on the cross of Christ all of the things that belong to him. That peace with God that we're not going to get any other way because left to our own devices, we do our best to make ourselves enemies of God, right? We have been given that life and that love that belong to Jesus Christ that is only his to give and that no one can take away. And so when we are invited to love our enemies, as terrible as that sounds, as hard as it truly is in reality, when we are called to love our neighbors, and that is hard, we have what we need. We have already been given what we are invited to offer to others. And it cannot be taken away no matter what they say on any commercial. The love of God has claimed us as God's own children. Thanks be to God.